John Matthews, you're a member of the Thurrock Local History
I am a member of the Thurrock Local History
Society. Have you always been interested in history?
No, I've not always been interested in history. I used to be a scientist by training, but I got interested a few years ago when just close to my house was a place where there was a gap between houses, and I wondered why there was this larger gap. I looked it up, and it turned out it was an old railway line that had been axed under the beaching cuts. And funnily enough, there's a similar example in Grays. In London Road, going towards Purfleet, there's a gap in the houses again. It's a bit more obvious in this case because it's clearly a bridge of some sort. And then you look down and there's this dip below on both sides. Once again, look at old maps, it was a railway line. But this one wasn't a public railway line, it was for carrying chalk down to a cement works. So the chalk had been extracted from what is now the nature reserve, and it was carried down this small railway line to the cement works. Tracks are gone now, but you can still trace the path in the landscape.
So is your day-to-day interest in history, and whether it's Grays or indeed Thurrock, is there a day-to-day interest that you have?
More or less, partly because of my membership of the Thurrock Local History Society. I get involved in projects there. But partly I'm interested because I've got an old house and I like to find out about the people who used to live there and its history. And then that became more general, and I became interested in all sorts of things that are going on in and around Grays.
Because there's a sort of art project here about past, present and future. There are people who have just moved into the Grays area or have an interest over the last 6 months. But there's also, I think, you go to Grays High Street and there's different high streets you can see, isn't there?
Oh, absolutely, yes. If you're walking along at ground level, what you're getting is 20th and 21st century shop fronts. You'll see them in any town. You look up, first floor and sometimes second floor, you can see what the buildings used to look like, and you can identify from old photographs that they're exactly the same buildings. All that's happened is that the frontage where the shop is has changed, and so you get a picture of what life, or at least what the buildings used to be like 100 or so odd years ago.
How do we preserve that?
Oh, I don't think necessarily you have to preserve it. Every generation has to do things that are right for it. Now, sometimes the generation makes what seem like reasonable decisions but turn out to be pretty bad. And for example, just after the war, there was a tremendous shortage of housing and the resources had to be put into building new houses. So as a result, a lot of old houses got pulled down. So we lost a lot of stately homes, some of them in Thurrock and all over the country this was happening. And it's a great shame that they disappeared. But on the other hand, you can understand that people felt that new houses were more important than preserving something that was 200 or 300 years old. So I don't think necessarily it's an absolute that you must preserve something. But if you can manage to do things in a way that does preserve and keeps the history, the heritage, then so much the better.
Because something like the State Cinema would be a good example. Fingers crossed, we seem to be moving forward, planning applications approved. But if that can look like a combination of old and new and it's still there, that's a good thing, isn't it?
That is a good thing, and that's one of the difficulties about preservation of heritage, is finding something that you can do now that will fund it. In the old State Cinema attracted thousands of people to watch the films and to listen to the organ. Well, you don't get thousands of people going to a building like that these days. You've got videos, you've got television and so on. So you've got much smaller cinemas like the ones at Lakeside. So finding a use for that space that will pay for it to continue to be maintained is important. I mean, the state has been like it's unoccupied now for what, 20 or 30 years, deteriorated drastically in places, suffered from thefts and so on. So clearly getting something that will mean that it is maintained is better than letting it just fall apart.
You're a member of the Thurrock Local History Society that meet in Grays. Tell us a little bit about the society.
Right, the society does a number of things. We have regular monthly meetings for 8 months of the year where we have a speaker coming along and talking to us. We publish a journal roughly once a year, although we've missed some years, where we publish articles about the local history. We have a website. We organise trips so that our members go and visit places either in Essex or perhaps further afield. And we've occasionally financed publications or helped with the publication of books about local history. So, for example, a couple of years ago, we helped to fund, or at least helped to produce, a booklet, or a book actually, a substantial book, about the building of the docks at Tilbury, which was a very interesting viewpoint because it looked at the story from the point of view of the members of a Masonic lodge, who were supposed to be brothers and you know, friends with each other, and they fell apart, had a big quarrel. One group of Masons sued another group of Masons. Eventually, the company was bankrupt as a result of the judgments against it, and that led to the formation of what is now the Port of London. Previously, there have been a lot of different docks, but this, the fact that one of them suddenly was faced with this outstanding bill that it couldn't afford, stimulated the whole amalgamation. So that's amongst the things we do. At our monthly meetings, we have speakers who come along and talk generally for an hour or so, sometimes on local history. So, for example, Hazel Sacco has been along and spoken to us about Tilbury Fort, Coalhouse Fort, and so on. And sometimes they're on more general history. One of our patrons came along a few years back, and he is an archaeologist who digs in Egypt. So he was telling us about the archaeology of the pharaohs and so on. So it varies enormously what the talk is about. But we get about 70 or 80 people along during the winter months to those sorts of talks.
That's a good number, isn't it? That's a good number.
It's a very good number. As you may know, a lot of societies now are finding it difficult to keep their numbers up and to raise finance, and we're amongst those. I mean, it's not as easy as it used to be 20 or 30 years ago, but we're still getting good attendance at our meetings, and we're also beginning to do a little bit in the social media, tweeting, Facebook, that sort of thing. So we're trying to keep up with the times, even though we're a history society.
Indeed, you know, here we are. This will be on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. What's the importance to you? What is the importance of history?
The importance of history is twofold. To me personally, it's something that I'm interested in. I find the little quirks fascinating, and I get sort of buzz if I discover something new. But I think the other important thing is that, as someone said, that if you forget your history, you might be doomed to revisit it. And there are an awful lot of things that have happened in the past. And sometimes perhaps the younger generation, I don't want to sound too patronising here, but sometimes the younger generation forgets that this sort of thing has happened before, and you might be able to learn a lesson from looking at how it was dealt with then, rather than try and work it out for yourself.
What about just not far from here, the Dell, Wallace? Have you been involved in work there?
Been very involved in that. As you may know, a few years back, the Dell came on the market. The nuns, the order of nuns that owned it and were living there, decided to sell it. And so we got involved in looking at whether there was a way in which we could preserve it as a heritage centre. Well, that didn't really pan out, but as a result of doing that, we discovered there were an awful lot of people in Grays who didn't understand that they had a world-famous scientist who had lived in Grays, built that house, and it was an important location from a historical point of view. So we managed to get a lottery grant, and we spent that publicising the fact that Alfred Russel Wallace lived in Grays, why he was important, co-discovery of natural selection, but also a number of other important things that he did. What Grays was like when he was living here. We did what you're doing now. We produced a video, about 30 minutes, in which we had a couple of experts, 3 experts actually, talking about the importance of Thurrock as far as Wallace was concerned, why he'd come here, why he was important, why what he did then is still interesting today. So we got heavily involved in that as a result of that project. And during the course of that project, Treetops, the site close to the Dell where Wallace lived, also came on the market. And we got a chance to look at something that had been in the garden of the old house in Treetops, which was a very deep cutting an old quarry probably, gravel possibly, but maybe chalk, that had been turned into a Victorian garden. Now, funnily enough, that's exactly what Wallace had done. Although his has now disappeared under houses, the next door garden, which would be very similar, still exists. And we managed to get in and have a look at it with the help of the council officials, and we discovered that there are still pathways visible. There was some sort of water feature where the water was brought up to the top of the hill, I suppose you call it, with a pump, and then allowed to go down through a series of features into a big pond at the bottom. There was a grotto at the bottom, which had clearly been used for private conversations or something. And so we really wanted to see that this was preserved, because it wasn't very suitable for building on. So we got in touch with the builders, and we got in touch with various other organisations, managed to put them together, and now, fortunately, although the housing's being built, that part is being preserved, and a platform on which people can look has been built. And what they're looking at is not the garden that Wallace produced in his house, but it's very, very similar. It's now overgrown, so you need a bit of an explanation to understand what's happened, but it is very similar to the thing that Wallace did in his own garden.
And so, in a couple of questions to conclude, I'm not going to get you drawn into the political arena, but there are plans for up to 32,000 homes in this borough. And it's important, though, so that places change all the time. That Grays may well, even in a short period. See, South Wales College, we've just discussed the state, the old courthouse is now business units. Things are changing all the time, aren't they? So does that stress that local history societies, which cover areas like Grays, are more important than ever?
I think it's an interesting problem that we have. I mentioned that we did the film about Wallace. One of the questions I asked the late Jonathan Catton as I interviewed him was, what would Wallace have found to be different if he came back and looked at his house and the surroundings? What would he find to be different? And the first thing that Jonathan said was the houses. When Wallace came here, which was the middle of the 19th century, this was a rural area. He could walk out of his front door and look over fields that went probably all the way to Southend without any major buildings, whereas now, of course, it's Dell Road, there's housing estates going on for miles beyond. So, yes, housing is one of the things that has changed things. But also, as things develop, you have to find new uses. I know a lot of people like to preserve windmills, and they look very pretty in the landscape, but a windmill is not an economic way of grinding corn anymore. So you have to adapt to the changes in economics and so on. And you can't freeze an area like Grays, or anywhere else for that matter. You can't freeze it and say this will forever look as it did in 1960, 1910, 1850, whatever. You have to find ways of preserving what you can and remembering what you can. As you say, the importance of a history society, it's a way of remembering, perhaps with photographs, perhaps with documents, perhaps with oral history, the sort of thing that we're doing here, remembering what it was like before.
John Matthews, thank you very much for your time.